Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fueling Collaboration. We're really excited to have so many participants with us today. We've got a really fun discussion in store for you. So everyone, my name is Andrea Brandon. I'm the Science Delivery Specialist with the Northern Research Station, and it's my absolute privilege to welcome you all today. Fueling Collaboration is a panel discussion series presented by the Forest Service, Northern Research Station, the Southern Research Station, and the Joint Fire Science Programs exchange networks that are all listed here. So we've got the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, the Southern Fire Exchange, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. So our goals are to bring together researchers and managers to learn about and discuss the latest in fire science and application, and to build collaborative opportunities across the region. This is our fifth of a five-part series for the 2021-22 winter series. So if this is your first time joining us, I encourage you to visit the fuelingcollab.com website to look at some of the recordings of our prior discussions. So today's discussion is titled Thinking About Fuel Reduction, and we have an excellent lineup of panelists that will help to unpack this topic for us. And our moderator is Jen Bunty, and she will soon introduce those panelists. But before we go on, I just want to acknowledge our organizers. So the folks listed here, Jen, myself, David, Craig, Virginia, Joe, Stephanie, Amanda, Jack. Man, this is an A+ team. I have really enjoyed working with, and everyone here has contributed to making this a fun and interesting and informative event. So thanks to this team for just being so awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it off to Jen so she can introduce today's panelists. Jen, take it away.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We were discussing that I think between me and Matt Callahan, we have a pretty strong Hibernian presence here on our panel. So starting off well. My name is Jen Bunty. I'm the Public Info Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. And basically, I talk about fire for my job all day, every day. I do a lot of work to tell the story about what research is coming out, what's happening on the ground. I'm a bit of a pyro propagandist, if you will. And today's panel came out of several conversations that I had. I often work as the public info officer for controlled burns, handling people coming by, handling the news media. And a while back, I noticed a trend that I would show up on a controlled burn and I would ask the fire management officer or the firing boss, okay, why are we burning? What do I tell people when they come by? And I kept getting the same answer. We could probably all say it together. It's fuel reduction, habitat restoration, wildlife. And when I would probe deeper and say like, well, what wildlife? Are we burning for badgers or bison? You know, what's going on? And I would start to get some more details, but I noticed that there's sort of a gap there in the stories that we tell when we're writing a prescription and the stories that actually translate and that build burn programs. And so I started to pull these panelists together. Each of these people has just a wealth of experience in burning for specific goals, in building burn programs, and getting results on the ground and using science to direct those programs. And so this is going to be a little bit of an experimental discussion. It's not quite like many of our Fueling Collaboration panels where each panelist is, you know, they're all sort of specialized in the same area of fire. So I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, talk about sort of the area of fire that they work in. And I'm going to pose that question, why do you burn, to start us off? So I'd like to start with Mac, if we can. All right, Mac, why do you burn? And tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Mac Callahan. I work for the U.S. Forest Service. I'm in a unit that's called the Center for Forest Disturbance Science. and the Athens Prescribed Fire Lab here in Athens, Georgia. And I've been with the Forest Service now for about 20 years, a little more than 20 years. And my original training was in tallgrass prairie, so I was glad to see that there were some people in the audience who are working in tallgrass as well. My first experience with fire started in the Appalachian National Forest, and then I went to graduate school in Kansas and worked on fire crews in tallgrass prairie. And since then, I've been working with the Forest Service, of course, and working all over the southeastern U.S., going from the mountains down to the coastal plain. And so why do I burn? I think this is, I may be the oddest ball on the panel, because one of the things that I've been most interested in my career is the influence of management practices, including fire, on soil and vertebrates. And because we are able to detect differences in the communities of soil and vertebrates that are coming from burned and unburned soils, we then ask the question, well, what does that mean for soil processes? Because soil invertebrates influence soil processes. And so that's really why I burn. So most recently that has been manifested in studies of invasive earthworms, which I think, again, will put me kind of in the oddball category, but we're interested in learning how invasive earthworm species respond to fire. And of course, we can talk more about that as the panel goes on. Thanks for having me, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Great, thank you for being here. Ben, would you like to go next?
Thanks for having me, Jen, and all the consortia. And just in that first slide of where are you from, I would have struggled because we've worked so much. I'm in Pennsylvania, but we work so much with CAFMs, but also with NAFC, and even throwing some oak woodlands in, and we did some work with lake states. I'm like, I don't know where I actually belong in this mix, but have really seen the benefits of engaging with you all. So appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Ben Jones. I'm president and CEO of the Rough Grouse Society. A bit about that organization. Was formed in Monterey, Virginia, 60 years ago. We had our 60th anniversary last year, and it was formed really by some individuals who are really interested in forest conservation and what forest management meant for wildlife. Rough grouse, you often think of maybe the lake states, formed in Monterey, Virginia, in the heart of the Appalachians. And we do more than rough grouse. We work for all forest wildlife, and we consider rough grouse really our flagship, or better yet, a bellwether for forest health. So we can talk about some of that at some point today. Me personally, before coming to the Rough Grouse Society almost 4 years ago, I spent just shy of 15 years as Habitat Division Chief with the State Wildlife Agency. And prior to that, I'd worked with the Forest Service in Western North Carolina and Mississippi. And forest wildlife management has always just been a passion for me and a career goal. And so, Jen, you kicked it off. We're burning for wildlife. Well, what does that mean? So as someone who's been steeped in forest management for wildlife, of course, the utility of fire just can't be overstated. And too many times I've seen forest management plans where the wildlife piece is number of snags retained or herbaceous interior openings. But we really need to think about wildlife management from a landscape scale. And of course, fire is a critical tool for that. And one last piece, I felt like as someone in public service, almost that it was my mandate to build a prescribed fire program. In the State Wildlife Agency, we were to deliver on implementation of our State Wildlife Action Plan and our State Forest Action Plan. All of you have a State Wildlife Action Plan, and most of them out there list lack of fire as a threat to wildlife conservation. So in some sense, why I burn, it almost felt like it was an absolute responsibility as a natural resource manager to put that science to work on the ground.
Great, thanks, Ben. Lindsay, would you like to go next? Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you burn.
Yes, thanks for having me. My name is Lindsay Ray. I work for the U.S. Forest Service for about the past 15, maybe 17 years, primarily as a wildland firefighter. Now I am a fuels technician on the Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest in Vermont. We also manage the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. And my primary roles are, as a fuels technician, is planning and implementation of prescribed fire. So I work as a burn boss and work closely with other resource specialists to return fire to the landscape, specifically for wildlife and pollinator habitat. And again, I did mention we don't really target species in our management efforts. It's really more focused on plant habitat, composition as well. So we do look a lot at low bush blueberry habitat, as well as areas where there are milkweed. So hoping to increase that abundance for pollinator habitat.
Thank you all for that intro. I know it's a lot to say, okay, why do you burn when you all burn for such varied reasons? But I'm going to ask you another sort of tough question to narrow it down is maybe tell a little bit of a story about how did you learn to burn for worms, soil health, low bush blueberry plant communities, grouse. Where did you start? How did you start these programs? How did you start to get this information? And feel free to jump in at any point.
I'll kick it off. I went from when I finished my bachelor's in forestry and wildlife at Penn State. I left there the day after graduation and went to southwestern Mississippi. So I went from a place with almost no fire being implemented at the time to a place where fire is still very much part of the culture. And my master's work there was focused on prescribed fire and impacts on wildlife. We're looking at growing season burning and potential impacts and benefits to wild turkeys during the nesting season. So that was it for me, from going to a state with very little burning to one with a whole lot, and pursuing a research project on the subject right away.
For me, I pretty much walked into an existing burn program dedicated for wildlife habitat. However, the difference is coming from my previous work with the Forest Service out west in both California and Oregon. I took a really strong interest toward fire adapted species and fire dependent species, and really looked at what that might translate to here in northern New England. And in so doing, finding those low bush blueberries as those key herbaceous components that really do respond well to fire, and for the most part need it for benefiting production or more abundance. Really honed into that and learned a lot from previous wildlife managers and firefighters, a few of them on this forest and our adjoining forests over on the White Mountain, to see what they were doing for reintroducing fire to actually spread the abundance of blueberry and enhance that through fire. So I think a lot of it is oral tradition of learning how to burn in those low bush blueberry. For the most part, in northern New England, our fire intensities are fairly low to moderate severity in its fire behavior. But for low bush blueberries, they certainly burn different, mostly like chaparral that you might find in Colorado for Gamble oak, or chaparral in Southern California or the Intermountain West. So they're a unique feature on that landscape, and learning through that oral history from folks who have retired or moved on to other careers has really been that source of knowledge and, of course, experience.
Yeah, so for me, Jen, you knew this was going to happen. It all comes back to the earthworm.
Love it. I love it.
So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Georgia, the guy that I was working for, who was in the ecology program, was contacted by the district ranger of the Apalachicola, one of the districts on the Apalachicola National Forest, and they had this situation going on in their forest where after the district would do a prescribed burn, there's this long-standing tradition of people going into the woods after that and collecting earthworms using this technique called grunting. It's crazy. I don't know how many of the people in the audience may have heard of this, but they drive a piece of wood into the ground and then rub a piece of metal across the top of it. It makes vibrations in the soil, and the worms start coming up. And so this district ranger was kind of a holistic enough thinker to realize that this may be having some kind of an impact, and that the earthworm resource needed to be managed as a non-timber resource for their district. And so the first step was to get a study done to determine whether or not this was actually negatively impacting the earthworm population. And so my professor, who was an international expert on earthworm ecology, and I went down there and set up a little study. And so the fire link was always there, right? The only time these people go in the woods is after a fire. And so we started to do, neither of us had any exposure to fire ecology at all at that time, but you had to, if you're going to work in Apalachicola, you have to understand fire to understand anything, right? And so I started dabbling a little bit at that point. And then that was my master's program. So then when I went to Kansas, it's again, tallgrass prairie is all about fire. And so that was the point at which I started sampling soils in burned and unburned soils. And I noticed a difference in the composition of earthworm community, which was that native earthworms were more abundant and in fact, almost totally dominant in burned soils, whereas non-native European introduced worms were present in the unburned soils. And these are plots that are literally right next to each other. You can take 2 steps from a European earthworm community into a native North American earthworm community, and the only difference is fire. And so that kind of set the ball rolling, and it's been going, as I said, for 20 years now. So it's all about earthworms for me.
It is. And I can't help but notice Lindsay and Ben's face when you mentioned the results of like I can see the wheels turning where they're like, well, how would this affect everything, from the ground up?
And that's it. That's the thing with fire, and one of just the most rewarding, frustrating, and intriguing things about fire is that learning process just never quits. And there's so much variability for those of us who have tried to pin these things down to R values and P values. The variability is just phenomenal, and that every time you're out, you learn a little something. And then the other part is the wealth of information, and gave a shout out early on to the consortia and the resources that are available there, the webinars and the publications. I mean, you will never stop learning in fire, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I must echo that, taking that information that you're gathering, that you're looking at your fire effects, how is that shared and translated? It is such a big obstacle. And so the consortia, thank you for that. I mean, we want more of these quick little fire science technical one-pagers even to share with our other resource specialists. So keep up the good work. Thank you.
It's our pleasure, believe me. I think I could speak for all of us, and we, there'll be more coming as long as we exist. That's what we do. I think, my background is not actually in communications, it's in population ecology. In population ecology, we always talk about the patterns and the processes, that phrase over and over again. It's not about the individual species, it's not about the blueberries necessarily, or the earthworms or the grouse. And I always carry that with me when I think about fire, because it's a pattern. It causes patterns, and it causes process, and it's such a huge driver of those things. And so when it's removed, of course, we see differences, even if it's, plot to plot right next to each other. Thinking on that and thinking about this, thinking beyond fuel reduction, I'm wondering if y'all can talk a little bit about fire return intervals and thinking about controlled burns in the systems that you work in, and how maybe that it's not just the one-time entry, it's not just about getting fire on the ground in one place at one time, but about building that larger system and sort of the benefits that you've seen of that, or maybe some of the challenges that came with building a program like that, so that it's not just about reducing fuels one time.
Yeah, there was a great quote that I've carried with me. Of course, in the early days of building our fire program, our partners at the Nature Conservancy just played such a huge role in what we were able to do. And Pat McElhenney, with the Pennsylvania's fire program and TNC, likened it to peeling an onion. So we're going into these systems that hadn't seen fire in forever, scrub oak, and just really stacked fuels and degraded habitat. And Pat talked about it like peeling an onion. So we weren't just in this for one time. And as you're trying to build a fire program, then you're trying to figure out, okay, then what's our return interval, you know, and these kind of hard and fast numbers. So then we turned to Mike Stambaugh, Joe Marshall, to get this historic look at, okay, what were the historic fire intervals here? And then we found there was all this really neat variability in that too. But so yes, it averaged every 4.5 years on the return interval, but there were these 12, 15-year fire-free period where pitch pine was able to regenerate and get a new cohort in. So as much as we were looking for those hard and fast numbers to build our program, lo and behold, we're finding that variability really was the spice of life in building a fire program too, and that we had to vary that return interval so that we could have regeneration pulses. So that variability in time and space, and you know, in forestry, the art and the science is really important, but man, with fire, just that art and that creativity piece was really there. Another part of it that I really love.
Yeah, fantastic. Lindsay or Mac, do you want to talk about fire return intervals a little bit?
I can jump in. I think that you know, the analogy of peeling an onion is completely apt, right? Because from my perspective, I'm a soils person, and so much of the onion that needs to be peeled, from my perspective, is that buildup of fuel and organic matter in the forest floor. And so you can think about that as in the same context as peeling an onion. You can't burn it all at once, or you'll have significant negative impacts on the biota that live in the soil and on the roots of the plants in the overstory and the understory, right? So you can't you can't do it all in one go, which is exactly what you said to start this part of the discussion off. And so I think arriving at that the perfect balance of prescriptions that takes just a little bit of that organic matter every time you burn, but not all of it, not too much and not too little, right? Because if you are too conservative, then you don't do any removal of that organic matter, which we can talk more about soil organic matter and how to work that to our advantage in terms of long-term storage. But yeah, I think that getting that interval exactly right and doing the prescriptions right so that you're taking just the right amount of fuel out of the forest floor at a time there is some art to it as well as science, certainly.
Definitely a lot of art to it in my perspective of things. You know, we can write our prescriptions as best as we can, but our current, you know, environmental factor is going to line up if we have such a short window, which in our case in northern New England, that's a big obstacle. So for Green Mountain National Forest, while we do conduct prescribed fire for habitat maintenance, it's mostly openings and vistas. We tend not to pay as much attention to the fire return interval based on like historical regimes or land fire data that we might get. Rather, we're looking at you know, end goal objectives, and how are we going to get there? How often do we need to return to that one piece of ground to maintain the open state for that early or young forest growth, that previously called early successional habitat, but we tend to call it young forest now. However, for some other habitat improvement, not in openings, we've been doing some oak management for enhancing in some very mesic sites, areas that are becoming a little more wet and shaded out from beech and maple. So we tend to look at land fire data, seeking that fire return interval. We've also been able to work with some fire researchers who can go and take fire tree ring samples and determine that return interval, because we're at such a small scale in Vermont, at least, for finding that large macro land fire history. So we do rely heavily on site sample to look at the fire return and see what we can hopefully mimic.
Yeah, I appreciate that you were talking about the vistas, and you basically said, we kind of go look at the forest and it tells us when to burn. And that's the truth, right? For a lot of these burn units that I know, even though they might be on a 2 to 4 year interval that they know is determined by all this research, they will still go out there and see, like, do we need to burn it this year? Is it high priority? Is it low priority? Because it all becomes about capacity and resource management as well. I think I also appreciate that Ben said, that there's a bit of an art to it. And each of you mentioned like a culture of fire that when I asked you your first question, or how did you learn to burn, you each mentioned that you learned from people that were burning actively. It's, it's a culture and it's an art, like you said.
But there's a real pitfall here of the old perfection being the enemy of good with your prescriptions, and just thinking about that fire regime and all of these things occurring across the spectrum. And it's really tough. We really fell back on photo monitoring a lot, because it was more of that kind of qualitative piece that I've mentioned this, I think, in every comment so far. The quantitative piece of fire effects monitoring is really difficult, and diversity is the thing that makes fire really unique. So it almost like defies parametric statistics in a lot of ways. So for us, and it was key for us growing a fire program, that we did have those broad parameters, and there were multiple end results that could be acceptable to that change in habitat structure. So that let us go forward without like freezing up the night before. Well, the humidity is going to be this, and we're just not sure if we're going to exactly hit that horizon just right. It gave us a lot more flexibility to go out and get fire on the ground.
Yeah. Speaking of flexibility, and I mentioned that this was sort of experimental for Fueling Collaboration, this discussion and this panel. Something I wanted to do was sort of turn some of our classic Fueling Collaboration topics and see how they're applied to the way that y'all burn and to the fire programs that you're a part of. And so one of the topics we covered a while back was seasonality, and how season of burn is considered. So I'm hoping that maybe you can jump in and talk a little bit about what season or seasons you burn in, and how you decided on that, and if you've considered expanding into different seasons, if you need more research. Just talk a little on that seasonality topic.
Oh, somebody else start this one. Go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I would say that the season of burn ought to be and could be 365 days a year. And so from our perspective, I mean, most of the burning gets done, kind of December, January, February, March, maybe a little bit into April, around where we are here in Georgia. But, there are people who argue that you should only burn during the growing season because it does this, this, and this for the plants, and it doesn't interfere with this, this, and this with the wildlife, and so on. And I think that perspective is maybe a little bit blindered. And so my perspective is, as a researcher and as somebody who works in this agency that manages so much land, that a burned acre is a good acre. And I don't think we don't need to hamstring ourselves with too much concern about seasonal burn. That's my bottom line. Obviously there are issues with exceeding air quality standards and that kind of stuff. So that certainly influences seasonal burn to an extent. But as far as the ecology of it goes, I don't think there's a bad day of the year to burn a piece of woods if you can get it to burn.
So I have a question, Mac and Ben. With your burn programs that you have quite expansive reach and acres burned for the resource. How does that, I mean, other sensitive species that may be considered, you know, when you're burning, how do you incorporate that into your burn plans as you mitigate for protecting those others, like maybe salamanders, you know, some aquatic or bats? How are you guys mitigating that or those constraints? Or how have you worked with other resource areas to kind of find that sweet spot?
Yeah, especially when you have some kind of regulatory piece of that, definitely something seasonally that you have to pay attention to. But I'll give an example for us I think shows how it can work. And with our the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, they had some concerns, and at the time, I think rattlesnakes were a potential candidate for listing. So there was concern over these, especially gestation sites, where only 5% of the rattlesnake population was reproducing in any given year. So clearly, these known gestation sites were really important. So when we started out, it was thou shalt not burn anywhere during this critical period for gestation. And as we went forward, working with our partners at the Fish and Boat Commission, we started talking about fire effects and structure and how important fire was in maintaining and increasing the number and size of gestation sites because it was freeing up sunlight to those sites. So similarly, we did a habitat conservation plan for forest bats, northern long-eared and Indiana bats. And we showed that over 30 years, the overall program benefits of burning was a net positive for those forest bats. And so showing those positives, and I never bought into, this might start a great debate here, the winners and losers. There are winners and losers and I think it's just different scales and different periods and different timing. So with rattlesnakes, for example, no, we didn't want to burn across the gestation site and kill a significant amount of the reproductive population. But working with our partners, we showed them the importance of loosening up those restrictions because more fire on the landscape overall meant better habitat for rattlesnakes. It means better habitat in the long term for bat conservation.
Yeah, I should be completely clear to the panel and the audience that I'm not an expert in planning and executing fire on the landscape. That's I just know what I have learned and have been fortunate enough to be around great fire management officers and AFMOs and people like that. And I've been able to go along on a lot of fires and study the effects of fires. But, you know, so yeah, certainly, and I'm seeing some stuff in the chat here about, you know, sensitive plant species and these kinds of things. And so, of course, you have to take those into account and try to, so I think the answer, at least, you know, with our local folks here, is that you apply the fire to the landscape in a mosaic so that you're not burning, you know, huge swaths at one time, so that in any given year, the places that have sensitive species in them are not burning all at the same time, right? So that's one thing. But yeah, you do run into situations where, you know, there are, and I understand what Ben is saying, that there, on the macro scale, there are no winners and losers, whereas on the micro scale, you can certainly say, look, you burned up that quail nest. What are you guys doing? But the point should be taken that the reason that quail nest is there in the first place is because it's been burning every 3 years for the last 25 years. So yeah, I think you have to, obviously there's, again, we're kind of getting into the art part of it, which I believe can be reduced to science if you use things like prioritization models where you identify places on the landscape that you definitely need to burn and you need to do them at this time of year and that time of year and these kinds of things. I think you can be fairly quantitative about it. But there may be some art involved in figuring out what factors go into those prioritization models. I feel like I'm
Seems like a lot of it
rambling.
was early on was having those discussions, whether it was with the natural heritage folks or the species experts on, okay, well, and I think one I can remember was blue false indigo, and we couldn't burn like ever because of this threatened plant. But digging more into the ecology of the plant, it was clearly fire adapted. So just having those discussions on, okay, how does this work in the bigger picture? And what grouse nests, the work I did with turkey nesting ecology in southern Mississippi, we found that brood habitat absolutely depended on the ability to have regular fire on the landscape. So a frequent burning program meant brood habitat, incredibly important to reproductive ecology of turkeys. So that extended window into the time when turkeys were nesting was a really important window to be burning. Did we burn up a few nests? Yes, but the overall population benefit was much greater. And quite literally, I guess, in this sense, you've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet is really true.
Did you have that in your back pocket for when you talk about nest success? I feel like the breaking a few eggs to make an omelet is just perfect. I think you've said that before. That was just great.
That one and peeling the onion. It's all about the kitchen.
Hey, as a comms person, you know, I can recognize the game of having your key messages. And I think, but it's true though, when you're building these programs, you need those key messages too. And I think we can empathize a lot as humans. The loss of a single nest or someone seeing some sort of species take or mortality it hurts, you know, it hurts to see it. It hurts us. We were all the kids, you know, picking up earthworms when it rains and all those things. And we were in this job because we care. And I think as a comms person, I try to get that message across, as well as the science that says, you know, if a turkey nest is destroyed, usually they have more success with the second one. It's just, you know, science. But thank you all for that. And thank you for the vulnerability of giving your honest opinions. So the next one I want to tackle, I'm sure it will be just as debatable. But one of the topics we talked about recently was how climate change and fire interact and what people can do to plan for climate change or what they're doing already to adapt for climate change in their fire work. And so I'm curious if any of you have made adaptations so far due to climate change that you can point to, or if you have plans to, or how you think it might affect your work moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can kind of graze that. Yeah. Just on the very surface. We've been working with our ecologist and silviculturist to look at vulnerabilities from climate change. And I mentioned oaks earlier. You know, depending on what models you're looking at, perhaps in northern New England, oaks might have a better chance at staying healthy. So that's one adaptation that we're looking at, and one more reason why we're looking to enhance oak through reintroduction of fire on the landscape. I can't speak too much to the change in fire behavior locally in such a short period of time in my experience in Vermont.
Yeah, it does seem that at that local scale, it's going to be more adaptive over time. On the climate side, one of the things that are really working on are how are the climate models structured right now? And this is forest management in general and prescribed fire specifically. Like if we get too carbon centric across these landscapes, then what other ecosystem functions are we sacrificing in the name of, you know, carbon storage only in the modeling? So we're really attentive to modeling that to the best of our ability that we need to have young regenerating forests that are sequestering today's carbon. So that high interest bearing account of young forests interspersed with older forests, that's our big savings account. But we can't have all your money just in the savings account part of carbon storage. And similarly with fire, and this is tough, this is nuanced for us because Forests are really important. And then of course we shouldn't cut a tree. Well, what's the nuance part of that? What's a decadent, and the carbon map, what's a decadent scrub oak community versus one that was just burned and is vibrantly growing? So on the climate side for us, I think we're really attentive to making sure that the modeling captures more than just carbon storage, and that beyond that, we're also talking about the importance of ecosystem function and not being too carbon centric.
I got nothing on climate.
No, the worms are just gonna hang out.
Just that it's changing, and yeah, the more we can learn about all of these processes, the better off we'll be as we move into the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, next one, and I'm not sure if this will affect any, but I figure I'll just float it out there and see. What about WUI? Does WUI influence your burn programs at all? Is it encroaching? Is it is it something you have to plan for when you do your burns, or something that you've interacted with much in your research?
I can speak to my experience on the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. On the Finger Lakes National Forest, it's fairly segmented, and the forest is surrounded by private property and homes, and it's kind of a grid system. There are roads, however, so that's always nice to have existing control features when conducting prescribed fire or if there is a wildfire. For Vermont, we don't have much consideration for WUI with our prescribed fire operations or wildfire, with the exception of folks' comfort level with fire. Because we're so far north, we don't see it all that much. Maybe our only exposure could be seeing something on the news about fire behavior. So the cultural shift of understanding low intensity controlled fire, prescribed fire is something that not everyone's familiar with yet. And I don't think we'll ever get there, especially in Vermont. We're all kind of hidden away through the mountainous, through the Green Mountains. And yeah, so that's all I have for WUI. Not too strong on my behalf.
Lindsay, your point about the perception issue is a really good one. As fire managers, we can, in most cases, especially with a lot of the eastern fuels east of the Mississippi, we can mitigate fire behavior and seasonality and do that safely, working in that WUI. Certainly more, it presents challenges and more logistics and all those things without question, but that perception issue, even if it's just the lowest intensity fuel model 8 or fuel model 9 leading up to a grass yard, when you've got a crew stacked up in somebody's backyard, then that perception issue is something that you're going to have to deal with. And I was talking to a friend in East Tennessee last night, and he was noting with what's going on with housing, the breakneck pace that development is occurring. So with each one of those subdivisions that's going in stacked up, of course, the prime location is next to the public land. It's presenting those WUI issues for us, whether it's direct threat of fire on those communities or the perceived threat, because now we're going to have that information officer going around to that new subdivision and working with our neighbors to make sure they understand what we're doing with fire. So WUI is a really big deal, and it's not decreasing by any stretch of the imagination. We get, I think in my home state, it's something like 400 acres of open space are lost to development every day. So that's all WUI. New WUI.
You said 400 acres a day?
Yeah, I think it averages about 400 acres a day lost to development. Yes.
Let's talk about earthworms, right? So from my perspective, one of the big things about WUI is the introduction of invasive species. And we know that people like to bring their favorite plants, and those plants often have animals associated with them that can be pests. And this is one of the big ways that invasive earthworms get spread around, is through people bringing potted plants from somewhere else and planting them in their yard. which often, as we're finding out, increasingly is right next to a natural area. So there, I mean, there are obvious issues with fire that have already been discussed, but one of the other big issues is that these interactive factors like invasive species, there might be a plant species that is either a fire promoter or a fire suppressor that is being introduced on the WUI. And so I think all of these things are, things that we have to keep in mind. I had another thing I was going to say, but I've lost it. Oh, and so one of the things that I think is really interesting about WUI is that people tend to start fires too, right? So the wildfire issue becomes a bigger problem in places where there's a lot more people. Just everywhere people go, those ignition numbers go up, right? Where there's fuel. So yeah, those are the things that kind of pop into my head about that.
Yeah, absolutely true. Well, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit here. The chat has been on fire. We can't avoid fire puns. And I think we have quite a few questions, but Amanda's gonna, I guess, summarize a few or pull out some of the ones she's most interested in and take over for just a minute.
Oh man, yeah. Thank you everybody for your really, really active engagement in the chat window. I'll see if I can distill down a little bit of what I've been hearing. So there were some really good questions back when we were starting and talking about ecosystem restoration after y'all introduced yourselves. So the idea that the three of you talked about in terms of objectives, burning for ecosystem restoration. We had a question and some answers in the chat about in places where fire has been excluded from the landscape for upwards of decades, how do you prioritize which wildlife species to burn for? And this question was coming from a person in British Columbia in Canada who says that moose has been an important species that responds to fire, but we've seen studies that suggest fire for moose is detrimental for caribou. So how do you decide where and what to start with? So you don't have to speak to moose and caribou specifically if you don't see them in your neck of the woods, but thinking about ecosystem restoration, how do you prioritize within that which wildlife species you might want to burn for?
Yeah, or looking at it as sweets as well. What else is associated with moose and what's the status of moose? And we turn to our state wildlife action plans for a lot of this. And so with the Ruffed Grouse Society in northern Minnesota right now, we are working with partners, the Nature Conservancy and others, on a moose habitat collaborative, because that work that we're doing for moose is going to benefit ruffed grouse. It's going to benefit a whole bunch of forest wildlife, golden-winged warblers, the whole suite. So when you're looking at it at that way, what's the threat status? What other suites of wildlife and what's their status? And it can help you come to that decision process.
I think you mentioned earlier, was that Ben or Mac, about your prioritization models? I would be interested to see some of those examples and see how easy it is for a technician such as myself to pull that over into my burn program and apply that locally. Maybe that's something that could help that individual in British Columbia as well.
I'd be really curious to know what the negatives are and look at some of the research with the negatives to caribou. And this is a good one for me because I really don't know about that system specifically. But once we really start digging in, okay, what about fire is the negative part for caribou? And can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we mitigate that negative somehow while still accomplishing some of our goals?
Yeah, I did not do a good job of describing the burn prioritization model. My colleagues, Joe O'Brien and Ben Hornsby and Louise Loudermilk, developed one for the Oconee district here on the Oconee National Forest, or the Oconee district of the Chattahoochee Oconee National. And it takes into account, I think the biggest thing is that the priority is set on the principle of don't lose a good acre so that you can try to benefit a bad acre, so to speak, right? So if you've got a place that's in good condition and you're maintaining it with fire, don't abandon it so that you can burn a new part on the landscape just to get that acre burned. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not, but that's kind of the operating principle of that model. And by all accounts, it's been kind of a success, and they're burning as many acres every year over the last 5 or 6 years since they started using this thing as they ever have. And so I'd be happy to put you in touch, Lindsay, I'd put you in touch with the people who really know what they're talking about when it comes to these models. I just know that it's been a success in our local region.
Awesome, thank you. There's been a whole lot of great discussion. The chat then kind of turned in the direction of the fire seasonality discussion, and also even before fire seasonality, thinking about fire regimes, not intervals. So I think the three of you had really, really good comments about fire seasonality. If you have any quick take homes on that, I'd love to hear them. But if not, then I can move on to another question related to climate change projections. So any quick take homes on kind of fire seasonality? Oh, Ben is on mute.
Did you have something, Lindsay? I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, thanks. You'd mentioned about examples of where fire was previously excluded for a particular reason to protect a specific species. And I think seasonality is worth going in more about that. You know, I have an example down for southern Vermont on the Massachusetts border where we have been doing only the first entry of prescribed fire in oak heath habitat. And our plan originally had areas of exclusion to protect a rare orchid. And after some digging, you know, we came to the understanding through Fire Effects Information System, a wonderful U.S. Forest Service database that is growing and needs to grow from field inputs. We bounced this off information off of our botanist to say, okay, well, this species, it is fire adapted, this Isotria orchid, and it's also dormant. So if that species were, that herbaceous species were up maybe a month or two later, that seasonality burn wouldn't have worked for including the previously excluded orchid patches. So I guess digging into your seasonality to figure out the constraints and work around your constraints is going to be very beneficial for increasing that burn program. And it's difficult. It takes a lot of work and really good communication, but it's possible from Ben and Mac too, from what you've shared.
And don't go just on the raw numbers of the thing. Think about what's going on qualitatively. So for example, you find out, and in most cases of the East, 90+% of burns occurred during the dormant season. But what do those 10% of burns mean? Like summer burns during exceptionally dry years can be ecologically incredibly significant. So I'm really curious to see with the drought year last year and some of the summer burns that were occurring in Minnesota, what that means, because those, although rare burns, can be ecologically very significant to the overall health of the system.
Mac, any additional thoughts on seasonality? I loved your, 365 days a year is a great day to burn.
That works.
Yeah, that's pretty much, I mean, if you can, I saw in the chat, somebody was talking about how they're still covered in snow. So that's not something we have to deal with down here much. But yeah, I mean, if you can get it to burn, then I'd say go ahead. And that's just, yeah, maybe not the most scientific point of view, but.
Yeah, but operationally, and as you're getting into the discussions about, WUI and about climate and fire, definitely a very, very important point.
Yeah, I guess the take home is it's hard enough as it is, right? To get permission to do this. So don't let something stop you from burning on a day that you can.
Sounds good. And I think that all of you have been segueing into the kind of climate change questions. So how do climate change projections on species adaptations, I guess both for flora and for fauna, how are those considered in fire planning, or how might you want to consider them as you're thinking beyond fuel reduction?
I need to hear that again.
So thinking about climate change projections and how those climate change projections are likely to impact different species. Each of you spoke to it just a little bit in your responses a moment ago. How are those considered when you're planning to do prescribed fire?
That is outside my area of expertise. I mean, just being honest. I don't know the answer or an answer.
I think most models suggest a need to make sure, if you don't, that you've got a fire program. If we just look at very generally within the Appalachian region, this northward movement of the oak, hickory, certainly more fire, I want to say more fire adapted, but shorter return, more frequent fire systems as they move north. I think it lends to the need for places who don't have a fire program that you're going to need one to make sure that adaptation is occurring and that you have these new systems and you can keep them healthy.
Yeah, I can echo that and kind of revisit what I mentioned earlier about looking at those oak pine communities in Vermont. That's what we're geared toward, a little expanding a little more on the landscape on the Green Mountain National Forest, with hopes of some models suggesting oaks might be more favored in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think that answered the clarifying question that our participant asked. To narrow down that question, should we focus on historic fire regimes or look at how those systems are likely to change in the future? It sounds like you gotta look to the future. The past can help inform current decisions, but you also have to look to the future and try to adapt to what is coming as it impacts all those different elements in the ecosystems that you're trying to restore. Let's see, we had another question related to climate and fire. So Karen is zooming in from North Florida, and she says, I was reading recently that as managers, we always want to do safe backfires, which tend to burn across the land more completely and give a clean burn. But historical fires would have been primarily head fires, which have a lot more variability, have more skips, and do a much better job of creating a mosaic. So any comments on backfires versus head fires and clean burns, et cetera?
Yeah, on any given unit, it all needs to occur. And this is that inherent variability. We've got to use backing fire from a safety perspective. And then there are those ecological responses and diversity that come from being able to let a head fire rip and do its thing on its own, hopefully out in the interior of much larger units. So yeah, I think especially when you're operating at scale, all of those things end up happening just naturally with fire doing what it does.
I can also share that in Northern New England, much of our intended ignitions to burn one large area is still met with that mosaic effect, regardless of our ignition patterns.
So Mac, was the thumbs up meaning you're good? Okay.
Yeah, I agree completely with what's been said. You know, the mosaic is the goal, and it usually happens on its own, so to speak.
Nice, nicely said. So I will try to turn things back quickly, but Mac, you had a few questions about worms. I'll see if I can synthesize them a little bit. Let's see. So you had Mike Stambaugh was wondering, I think when you're in your introduction, what was the cause for the different earthworm responses? And then you had a question about fire and Asian jumping worms. And then you had a question about fire benefiting native earthworms, and just, addressing the fear that too much fire will damage soil fertility. And then there was a question also about fire effects on earthworms, such as eastern oak and pine. So a lot of wormy questions here. I'm happy to repeat different ones. You can just respond to whatever makes sense to you.
So off the bat, yes, Asian jumping worms and fire. We had, and I'm happy to interact with any of the people in the audience one-on-one too. Just email me. Just, all you got to do is Google Mac Callahan and earthworm, and I'll be there's only one of us, thank God. So we have done one little study where we set up these test beds with the Asian jumping worms, one of the species, one of the 11 species that are now currently extant on the continent. And we found that, yes, prescribed fire, these were very low intensity fires, and it was kind of a Mickey Mouse setup, but it was the best we could do. Fires were moderately effective at knocking back the populations, and we probably don't need to go into details here, but I'd be happy to talk with anybody about that. The mechanism, we didn't actually test the mechanism, but I have a lot of ideas about why the native earthworms were benefited by fire, whereas the non-native ones were not. And that, I think, had to do mostly with changes in vegetation. So when you burn tall grass prairie frequently, you get dominance of grasses and a little bit less importance. And in this particular study, the treatments had been going on, burned every year versus unburned for like 20 years at this point. So there was a lot of woody stuff built up in the unburned plots. And that created a completely different microhabitat in the forest floor, or the soil surface, I guess is a better way to say it, in tall grass. And there were some pH changes, which I think benefit the non-native species. But I think the primary thing is that the native North American species, and again, this is conjecture on my part, but I think they're grass rhizosphere specialists. They all live below ground. They don't do any activity on the soil surface like some of the European ones do. And they seem to really benefit when there's a lot of grass present and grass roots in particular in the soil. And that's true not just in tall grass, but everywhere we've looked. And again, I don't want to hijack the whole conversation and talk about worms all day, which I could do. But those are kind of quick and dirty answers to the questions. And please, if you want to follow up with something more specific, contact me.
Yeah, if you have a moment to drop your email into the chat.
Yeah, I'll do that.
That'll blow up your email within the next 20 minutes, I am certain. All right, I've been trying to keep half an eye on the chat. I think there's been a lot more really good conversation coming in, but I'm having a little trouble distilling down specific questions. There's just been so much great conversation and input from folks in the chat as well. So there's Mac's email. I think I would like to turn it back to Jen, who's got a good wrap-up round or two to help us get through this. But thank you for addressing our live chat questions, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you, Amanda, for jumping in with those. As Andrea said, we've got a great team of people here, so we're able to sort of move into these positions. And I appreciate all the panelists for being flexible with that. So as we kind of get into the last portion of our discussion today, I want to ask you about your challenges. Maybe if you could share a challenge you overcame while building these programs, or one that you're facing now. Originally, when we started this series, we also talked about it being fodder for future collaboration. So if you have, an ask for a future collaboration, some, research you need done or support you need or a site you're looking for, this is your opportunity to ask.
I can share a current challenge with the fire program that I work in is while we talk about historical fire regimes and intervals and all the great land fire data, we still are struggling to meet that message of where fire is appropriate on the landscape. And that has to do with internal, external partners in northern New England. So I think that is the area that we need some robust TLC to allow for fire on the landscape. And we have many constraints as it is, but really just that where fire is appropriate. recognized culturally and across agencies and partners is where we need a little more loving.
So you're saying it's more of a like communications, or is it more of actually identifying those areas and getting the science behind it to identify them?
Well, both. I think that the communication is going to be key. You know, we can have our research, and the research is there and information is there. It's really about getting it applied.
That's it for sure. And with the program build that I was involved in, we had all the challenges. It was laws that only applied to arson law, to the issues, a culture of not burning, no training, no equipment. It was all of those things. And working through those, certainly quite a challenge. And that's what actually brought me to the nonprofit world, was that knowing through working with the consortia that a lot of other states and programs were seeing these same challenges, and how as a nonprofit partner could we help bridge some of those gaps. But you know, the challenges are going to be there without question. And what I found that it really takes in states or programs that are successful is you've got relatively few people who just don't take no for an answer, that they really push through, climb over, get shoved back, regroup at each of those challenges, and just really look at it as their mandate for ecosystem restoration and conservation, that we need to have a fire program. And for the success of the program I was part of building back in 2006 to 2009, there were about 4 to 6 people who really led that charge. And that's who you really need to find, who are your super ambassadors and really stubborn, bullish people that just want to push that thing forward, because there will be challenges and you've got to knock through them.
Yeah, I think I could riff on what has been said already by just saying that to me, the biggest challenge is getting people to think holistically about fire as an ecological process, right? And I think that the solution to this challenge is things like what we're doing today, which is to talk about thinking beyond fuel reduction, right? It's not just about fuel reduction, it's about an ecological process that is either missing or is not being applied in the appropriate regime, or whatever terminology you want to use, and think about things beyond that. You know, that every single biological entity in an ecosystem is going to have some response to fire, and we need to consider all those when we're talking about it. And
Yeah.
again, I'm not. I don't feel like I'm articulating it very well, but the only answer is things like this, right? That gets the message out that there are things to consider. You know, whether it's grouse or earthworm or blueberry, all of those things are going to have some reaction to a fire program, and communicating about them is the best way to get the message out, I guess.
Just Jeb put a figure in there, and this is true for everybody. In your state forest action plans, your state forest health assessments are all going to show this out. In Wisconsin, they're burning 50,000 acres per year, but the ecological assessments say they need to be at 1 million. And just for us to recognize that right now we're in a natural systems wise a very strange little 100-year blip without fire, and the bigger picture of everything else. So this is not normal. And whether this helps in communications or not, Jen, you could give guidance on that, but this is a very strange fire-free blip, especially in the context of humans across these landscapes.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about, I like to say that I'm an Appalachian American. My family's been in the Appalachians for like in the same valley for a few hundred years. So we have a long history here. And I usually, when I'm communicating about the history of fire and the need for fire, I throw in that idea like, no, we've been here, and there is familial and generational memory of when people used to set fires and burn with their neighbors really regularly. And there's some places where it never stopped. You know, there's some places, especially in the Southern Alps, where that never stopped. But I think that's a good point, that it's a blip. It's a blip in the history. Okay, so we have time for maybe 2 more questions before we've got to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you each, what's next for you? What's next for your research or your burn program? What's something you want to share that you've got cooking? I didn't think that would be the stumper question.
No,
I'm not gonna, I was surprised at the pause.
Alphabetical order. I've got one, but
yeah, I'll take the bait. I mean,
there you go.
So the yeah, I mean, there's never any shortage of questions for people who do fire research, right? I mean, and it's the nature of research. I feel like if you're doing it right, then every time you think you've answered something, you only reveal 10 more questions, right? And that's kind of a cliche, but it's real. And so for me, you know, our group, the Athens Prescribed Fire Lab, is really involved in fire program development for everybody in the Southeast who wants to participate, right? So we think we've identified a few big problems. For me, for the soils person, we're interested in trying to develop prescriptions that'll help people manage the organic matter in the forest floor, right? Trying to remove some of those accumulations of organic matter that can be problematical when you do get a wildfire. And so trying to help people work on prescriptions to manage that over decadal timescales, I think is probably going to be the next big thing for me. And of course, I'm always looking for collaborators. I don't know who it was, somebody from Minnesota, it looked like, who asked a question about Asian jumping worms. If you want to test some fire approaches to managing those worms, and give me a call and I'll be on my way post haste.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Sure, I may have mentioned this earlier, but we're really looking at a grander landscape approach for reintroducing fire in oak and pine natural communities along the Green Mountain and hopefully into adjacent non-federal lands. And that's likely going to be a big lift, especially from small fire program, a small forest such as the Green Mountain National Forest. But we're tapping into our state and private researchers and research technicians. Angie Hammond is one of them who provided some great compilation of pollinator habitat, fire effects on pollinators. We're connecting with Vermont's Center for Eco Studies to jump on board with our existing fire effects monitoring and grander silviculture monitoring at one site where we'll be doing our second entry of fire this spring in oak heath habitat. And yeah, just looking at that as kind of a proof of concept so that we can expand that landscape approach in other areas in Vermont. So that's kind of what's on the plate, what's coming. It's building into something hopefully that will support a healthy ecosystem approach to fire on the landscape.
For us, it's about helping build capacity. So I see our role as a nonprofit partner. And like I said, we would not, when I was on the state side of things, been able to build a program without our partners at the Nature Conservancy. And so for us, it's about identifying those gaps with you all and helping you fill them in the best ways we can as a nonprofit partner. So on the green, what do you need and where can we help with that? We just secured some grant funding to stand up the first prescribed burn association in North Carolina, Jen, with the caveat that, of course, there have been cultural prescribed burn associations for a long time in the Southern Appalachian region, but a current day PBA. So we can go after those grant funds and help stand those things up. In Wisconsin, we have a bunch of private lands foresters that work with private landowners. So we're looking at ways to organize them into a roving fire crew so that when DNR or the Forest Service is burning, they can be pulled in as a resource. So for us organizationally, as a nonprofit partner, we're all about building capacity and working with you all, identify gaps and figure out how to shoot the hole and remove those barriers.
I was going to ask if you had an inside scoop on a as needed burn crew. We've had a couple TNC models start burning with us in the past couple of years, and they are really getting some things done.
Awesome.
All right, so we are approaching our time. So I'm going to give you one more opportunity. What's your take-home point? What's your final thought for the day? What do you want our audience to leave saying? I saw Mac and Ben and Lindsay Ray, Sylvia talk, and this is what they told me. Anything we didn't cover that you feel like you need to get out?
I guess my take home would be for folks to share their success stories. And from that, we can, the rest of us can gather and build upon those. So we're not all working separately in different silos, reinventing our own wheels.
Yes. Back to that culture of burning, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's probably it for me, is that the culture of burning, as Ben pointed out earlier, is one that's pretty much predominated human history, right? Humans are a fire species, and it's only been in this last century, mainly under the influence of European cultures, that we've stopped applying fire as a species to the landscape. And I think that we can do better, I guess.
I would say that really, to boil this down, there's plenty of research out there. We know fire is an absolutely essential part of these systems. We've got documents that mandate us to do this work, and nobody else is going to do it. So we need to find those people and those partners who are ready to go and ready to attack these really difficult issues. And instead of getting hung up on, well, we're just not sure about this fire thing. Fire is absolutely essential, and having fire programs to restore these ecosystems is absolutely essential for all the things that we're directed to do. And so we've got to do it. If we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. So it's on us.
Yeah, thank you. And just thank you all. Before I kick it over to Andrea here to close this out, I just want to say thank you all. In the Appalachians and around in the consortia, we often say the best work gets done over beers and barbecue, which feels appropriate for St. Patrick's Day as well. But it's because it gives us that time to just sort of think and chat and have these, experimental discussions with no stated goal, but where we can all just share what we've learned and what we're thinking and what our challenges are. So I really appreciate the three of you taking that time to do that today, and for your candor and for sharing your knowledge. And Mac, I want more fun facts about worms, just all day, every day.
Yeah, I got a million of them, so
Yes,
be
awesome.
careful what you ask for.
Thanks
that,
for the
I'll-
platform to do it. It's a really great platform, and appreciate all that it takes to get these together. So thank you and the team.
Great. With that, I will kick it over to Andrea to close us out.
Thanks so much, Jen and Lindsay, Mac, Ben. This has just been such a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I've also really enjoyed a lot of the connections that are happening in the chat. I've been, in private chatting with someone named Dan who lives just a couple of miles down the road, and we're going to get together and talk. And those are the kinds of connections that we are hoping this Fueling Collaboration panel discussion will spark. I loved seeing multiple folks put their emails in the chat window and say, hey, I want to talk about this, or you want to talk about earthworms, give me a phone call. So this is the goal. This is what we hope to accomplish with Fueling Collaboration, and it's just really exciting to see. And so I just want to say again, thank you so much to our panelists for your insights, your brilliance. I just have really enjoyed the discussion. And thank you so much to all of our participants for your active engagement, the questions, the comments. It's just been a really fun past hour and a half. As I mentioned during the intro, this was a 5-part series, and this was the last of our Fueling Collaboration panel discussions as we're moving into field season. But stay tuned, because the team that has pulled this together, we would very much so like to continue. And so I'm going to encourage everyone right now, if you have a topic that you would like for a Fueling Collaboration panel discussion to be built around for next year's season, put it into the comments right now, and we'd love to get that input. If you don't have it right in the top of your head, send one of us, myself, Jen, Amanda, Jack McGowan-Stinsky, send one of us an email, because we'd really love to get your feedback as well. So with that, we can call it a wrap. Thank you again so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.